On the Sunday morning of August 13th, 1961, the government of the ironically named German Democratic Republic, what everyone else called East Germany, began constructing a wall through the middle of Berlin. It would divide families, friends, and in some ways the world for nearly 3 decades. Its purpose was to stop the never-ending stream of East Germans abandoning the communist regime for the freedom and opportunity of the West. Attempts to cross it could be deadly. 136 people died trying. Our first guest was born in East Germany around the time the Berlin Wall was built, and she was one of the 17 million East Germans whose lives would radically change with the sudden decision to knock down the wall 25 years ago this month. We welcome Sabine Birking, a literary critic and a professor at the Institute for the International Education of Students in Berlin, where she joins us via Skype. Guten Tag, guten Abend, whichever you prefer. Frau Birking, it's good to have you on TVO tonight. Can I just get you, for starters, to share with us what you remember of how you felt 25 years ago on November 9th when the wall came down?
It was a moment of excitement, but it was also a little bit frightening because nobody really knew what's going to happen. And so I think it was kind of a mixture, and I definitely remember that I didn't sleep very well that night.
You didn't sleep well?
Probably not at all.
Okay, but did you try to cross into West Berlin that night?
No, I did not, because I lived a little bit outside of the center of the city, and so when I got home, the TV was already on, and my boyfriend at the time, he watched it, and then we watched it. We kind of were glued to the TV set, and when we thought it might make sense to go, it was so late, and somehow we decided to wait for the next day. So I didn't cross that night.
Okay. Tell me, I'm told that your office window overlooked the Berlin Wall. So you essentially were looking at that thing virtually every day. What was it like to have to look at that thing every day?
It was odd because I was an editor for Soviet, at that time, mainly Russian literature, and Gorbachev was already in power in the Soviet Union. It was a very odd situation for us because first time we could not publish many books that came out in the Soviet Union during these years. And so I was sitting in my office reading books that potentially I could not publish. And I was overlooking Tiergarten and the column of Victory with the Golden Alley, a place just at walking distance where I imagined in my lifetime I will not be able to go. So it was kind of an abundance of time and in a very limited space.
I must say, growing up in Canada, I always, when I thought of people like you, thought of you as prisoners in your own country. Did you feel that way about it?
A little bit, yes. It was rather, compared to other communist countries, also in Eastern Europe, say Romania or Poland, it was a rather comfortable prison, not a golden cage, but maybe a silver one. So there was no real shortage of essential things. But yes, it was a kind of a prison. When
you, living in the East, thought about the West, what did you imagine, quote unquote, the West to be?
I think the East Germans, of course, had a relatively realistic picture of the West because we could watch West German TV every day. So we saw it every day on the TV screen, but our imagination, how it would be, was probably unclear. So too much glamour and that was kind of transported, and so probably our picture was not really realistic. It became different when we experienced it.
Were you jealous of West Germans?
Jealous? Yeah, probably, because we saw there on the lucky side of history.
When you looked at that wall, did you ever think to yourself, I wonder if this thing is ever going to disappear, or is it always going to be here for the rest of my life?
Sure, we saw this almost every day, and I thought it will be there for the rest of my life.
And what was your view about the as we called it back then, the communist East German system of government that you were living under. What did you think of it when you were living under it?
Of course, we were critical. We became more and more critical during the last years of the existence of East Germany. But you have to imagine you always would compare it to other communist countries. And in summer '89, I went to Romania, which was under Ceausescu, a really terrible dictatorship. And coming back in September from my vacation time in Romania, I was hiking in the mountains. Actually, East Germany looked pretty nice. So it's always a question of comparison.
So eventually, you did see more of the West, and eventually, did you come to think, wow, okay, so that's what I've been missing? Did you have one of those kind of moments?
Yes, but much later. I think what I was most angry about is the censorship in East Berlin, and when I realized there's so many books that you only read when you're 20, and you can read them later, but you read them in a different way. So it was more the kind of intellectual things that I later learned that I missed. Yes, it was not so much material things.
Sabina, when they did have the big celebrations just a few days ago at the Brandenburg Gate, did you go to that celebration?
No, and most of my friends didn't, because there were 2 million tourists in the city. And you know, we have Berlin every day. It's a great city to live in. Come to Berlin and see it yourself. But we rather have the city on days where it's more calm. So I watched some of it on television, but I didn't go. The city was already crowded at 10 o'clock in the morning, and I stayed at home and had dinner with my daughter.
I don't want to read anything into that decision, but did you think the 25th anniversary was somehow not worth celebrating?
I think it is worth celebrating, and I think Germany achieved quite a lot in the last 25 years, not only due to unification, but in general, the country became more cosmopolitan, especially Berlin. Many things changed, and I wish some things would have changed more, but sure, there is a lot to celebrate.
Well, let's talk about one of those potential changes. We've been sort of hearing for years that there are big differences between Aussies and Westies, former East Germans and West Germans. Do you think that's true? Big differences between the two?
Yes, for my generation, for the, let's say, older generation, there are differences in upbringing, in gender roles, in the way we were educated, in the way we deal with everyday life. For the younger generation, this becomes less and less important. There are other things that become more important, class differences, whether you were born in a rural area or a metropolitan area. But for my generation, this is for sure true. Where's
your husband from?
My husband is from the West.
And do you notice sort of differences in character between the two of you?
Every day, but I think this is not only due to East and West, but of course my husband is the 68, young 68 generation from the West, very liberal in the way he deals with things, and I'm more, as we say in our family, he's more the liberal, and I'm sometimes called the Stalinist, very strict when it comes to doing homework or for my children, or so we just have different views on life, that's for sure.
I see.
But we get along very well almost since 25 years.
Well, having said that, if you were to meet somebody today, 25 years after the wall came down, do you think you could tell whether they were an Aussie or a Wessie?
If it's my generation, in most of the cases, yes.
And how can you tell?
Aussies are not as self-confident. They tend to listen more and speak less. They often also have a different style of dressing. Here in Berlin, you can see this when you go to theaters. People in the theaters in West Berlin look a little bit different from people going to theaters in East Berlin. So you can still tell, but only in the older generation. But not in 100% cases, this is true, of course.
Now, I'm told once upon a time you lived in the United States for a while. Was it in Chicago?
Yes.
And did you visit the German consulate in Chicago?
Yes, I did.
What happened there?
It was on October 3rd, which in Germany is the new national holiday. I went to the celebrations of unification, and the national anthem was sung, and I just out of a reflex started to sing the East German anthem. And people looked at me, and I have to admit it was quite, I felt not very comfortable in this moment, but I realized that I never learned the German national anthem, and it would maybe also have been a good idea to create a new national anthem after '89 for both countries and not use the old one. Also, the old one is fine too, but maybe. I think many East Germans don't know the text of the national anthem.
Let me ask you one last thing, and that is, if you could sort of wave a magic wand and remake Germany in the way that you wanted to, how would the country 25 years after the fall of the wall, how would the country be different from the way it is today, and therefore perhaps in your view more worthy of celebration?
I think it could be even more European. I also think that some changes that were made in Germany in the very last years in terms of gender roles, in terms of education, could have been made earlier. So let's say the East German educational system wasn't as bad, and some things, so the good things of East Germany and the good things of West Germany could have been put together earlier, and maybe the whole country would have benefited from this.
Sabine Birking, das war sehr ausgezeichnet. Dankeschön und Wiedersehen.
Have a good night or have a good evening.
Thank you very much. Up next, we'll explore further the legacy of the fall of the wall, right after this. November 8th, 1989 is one of the most important dates defining the course of the 20th century. Without violence, an exhausted and morally bankrupt political system gave way to a most uncomplicated demand. People now able to walk around their city, the whole city. Freedom of movement led to freedom of speech and the freedom to vote. Less than a year later, the two Germanys became one. Let's consider 25 years of no wall and one Germany. In Hamburg, Germany, via Skype, Joseph Joffe, the editor of Die Zeit. In London, United Kingdom, via Skype, Adrian Pabst, political scientist at the University of Kent. And with us here in studio, Janice Stein, TVO's foreign affairs analyst, also at the U of T's Munk School of Global Affairs, and Randall Hansen, director of the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies, also at the University of Toronto. Good to have you two here in our studio in Leaside, and our thanks to our guests who are on the line overseas as well. Let me set up our discussion by just putting a few quick facts on the table here. Unemployment rate in East Germany now is down to 9.7%, but a lot of experts say that's because people have left the East and have moved westward. The GDP has grown from 33% of the Western average in 1991 to 67% in 2013. Big gains there. However, workers in Eastern Germany are apparently, we're told, 3/4 as productive as their Western fellow Germans. Let's get into this. Joseph Joffe, Helmut Kohl, the chancellor at the time of German unification, said he envisioned blooming landscapes in the East after reunification. How accurately do you believe his prognostication has come true?
Well, at least we got blooming autobahns in the East. They're better than in the West. They probably have a better internet than we have in the West. They have more modern production facilities than we have in the West because they came later. And I think that some of the numbers you just quoted are become a hell of a lot more impressive when you think about, so to speak, the baseline in 1990, when the GDR had zero GDP, so to speak, because its industry had simply disappeared from the market. So I think 25 years is a nice, has seen a nice catch-up, though those differences you just mentioned remain. I mean, I can give you another one which might be interesting. Average monthly wages in the West are 3,600 euros, and average wages in the East are 2,700. But back in 1990, the first year, they were 1,900. So that's quite a climb, I think, from 1,900 to 2,700. That shows you how the gap is being closed pretty rapidly.
Sure. Having said all that, Adrian Pabst, how differently and maybe preferably could the reunification of the two Germanys have happened in your view?
Yeah, I think shock therapy was not quite as successful as some others believe. Largely because there was industrial capacity that, given the chance, could have been preserved, renewed, and then also grown over time. So had, for instance, Eastern Germany become a special economic zone, I think that some of the industry there could have survived. And as it happened, it was shock therapy. It was a takeover by Western business. And I don't think that necessarily was to the advantage of Eastern workers and Eastern industry.
Randall, let me pick this up with you. Klaus Schroeder, German political scientist, recently quoted as having said, many East Germans still feel alien in the reunified Germany, which has taken over the institutions and values of the old Federal Republic. Even if only a small minority of about 10% to 12% of the East German population wants to have the GDR, East Germany, back, a large majority feels strange in a united Germany. When was the last time you were in Germany?
Last summer.
Did you pick up any of that sentiment?
Well, my apartment's in Prenzlauer Berg, which is mostly populated by West Germans who've moved to East Germany, so I don't have perhaps the best perspective. What I would say, though, is over the last 20 years, I don't agree, because I think if we break it down by age, what we find is that that may be true of older ex-East Germans, but for very young East Germans, we're seeing the values gap and the sense of identity, the values gap and the identity gap, if you will, shrinking between East and West. And that's precisely what you would expect. And again, 25 years isn't very long. I think it's actually been quite successful.
Janice, I wonder if you would more accurately describe what has transpired as a capitalist-communist divide, which was huge back then, and admittedly 25 years later not as big, or is this more a case of regional disparity, as we would say compare Alberta with the Maritimes in Canada?
It's interesting that you put it that way, because when Adrian was talking, I was thinking about the Rust Belt states in the United States, where industries have frankly disappeared as globalization has deepened and workforces are alienated and have had to be reskilled and retooled. And the story of a unified Germany is not all that different, but clearly there's more here, Steve, than just that. Because you had two very different political systems, two such different cultures, not as sharply drawn as communism and capitalism, which is the way we hear about it, because the communists were never very communist and the capitalists were not. It's very difficult to describe West Germany as at the forefront of innovative capitalism. That's not who the West Germans are either.
No, but the East Germans had a Stasi, and they shot people for going across that wall.
Yeah, but that's not. That's not the economic picture.
Right.
So the real difference, I think, is in the political culture on both sides of the wall, and that takes a longer time for the culture to change. I agree with Randall. 25 years is a very short time. And when we look at most of the markers, the progress is really remarkable.
Having said that, Joseph, I want to ask you about fear, because some people in the rest of the world weren't thrilled at the prospect of German unification. The French writer François Mauriac said, "I love Germany so much, I am glad that there are two of them." And I wonder whether the fears of European neighbors 25 years later have gone away.
May I add a footnote to what has just been said about, the divide?
Please.
Look, if you think back about the Civil War in the United States, it really took about 100 years for the South to be reintegrated into America as such. Now look, and you've heard about in high school history about the carpetbaggers who took over the South.
Right.
The paradoxical thing about this country is that they took over us. The East took over us, meaning the president is from East Germany, the chancellor is from East Germany, and for a while even the Speaker of the House was from East Germany. So just try to transfer this analogy to the Congress and the United States administration, and that gives you a good idea how quickly the political systems and the political cultures came together. Now to your question, I think it's a very good one because everybody in those days spoke about the Fourth Reich. And everybody was quite afraid, and the French and the Italians and the Brits were quite obsessive about trying to break or even prevent reunification for precisely those historical memories. The funny thing or the ironical thing is that these predictions didn't pan out at all. You don't see a Fourth Reich. You see a united Germany, which is, to use Maggie Thatcher's words about England, is punching below its weight. There's none of that Wilhelmine imperialism, let alone Nazi imperialism. This new Germany is actually more meek and more modest as a player in Europe than anyone would have expected. And that, I don't know, it's hard to explain, but it's a fact which needs to be kept in mind, given those fears that you just mentioned.
Janice.
They were very real.
Joe's comment is very interesting because I agree, but there's a funny flip that history has taken. As German economic muscle has grown in Europe, where it is now, the most powerful economy in Europe.
Indisputably.
Indisputably. Those on the periphery who have done far less well, Greece, Portugal, Spain, you hear echoes of that older worry coming back now with quite some vigor, clothed in language, but fundamentally recreating a fear of Germany, not of its military might, but of its economic might and its capacity to shape their future. I was very struck by that when I was in Europe.
Randall.
Yeah, I mean, 2 points on that. One is that's true to a degree. In a sense, they brought it on themselves. They wanted the euro much more than the Germans wanted them to have the euro, so we mustn't forget that. Point two, though, I would say that there's a different sort of fear in this. You get the sort of cliches about the jackboots and Nazi symbols in Greece and this sort of stuff at the periphery, but the biggest fear is that the Germans will do nothing. So those who are most critical of German leadership are the same ones who are calling for more of it.
Adrian, let me get you in on this. Since you're in London, I should quote Margaret Thatcher back to you. She was especially concerned, of course, about Germany abandoning the Deutschmark and adopting the new European common currency. One of her advisors referred to that as a German racket designed to take over all of Europe. How do the fears of a reunited Germany look in London, England, 25 years later?
Certainly, the fear that Germany was going to dominate Europe politically has not come to pass, and I think I entirely agree here with what Joe and Janice and Randall have said. I think economically there is still a question of whether Germany is defending the euro and imposing austerity really to save the common project, or whether it's also largely because it helps its own economy to export and to generate enormous surpluses. I think Germany needs to think that its own well-being is really tied up with the rest of the Eurozone much more, because now that the periphery is in such recession, of course, German exports to the periphery are also suffering. And Germany may well be heading for double-dip recession. So I think there needs to be more common thinking of what the Eurozone is for and how Germany can shape it in a way that works for everyone. And politically, I agree, there is also a need to take up more leadership, because there is a vacuum at the heart of Europe. The French aren't filling it, the Italians, the Spaniards aren't filling it, the Brits are half in, half out. I think a more politically engaged Germany would be welcomed by many.
Joseph, let me follow up on that, because it was a few years ago that the former Polish Foreign Minister Radek Sikorski said that he didn't fear German power, he feared German inactivity. Need he have been worried?
Germany is a bit like a small America. You're damned if you do, if you're damned if you don't. If you do too much, you're accused of imperialism, in this case, monetary imperialism. And if you don't do enough, you're accused of betraying your responsibilities to the larger whole. So that is something that you cannot escape if you're a very powerful player on your stage. I'm not sure that the euro is so much of a boon to Germany, because in the course of the euro in the last 10 years, the Germans have accumulated a lot of liabilities left by others. And if these liabilities ever come home to roost, Germany is going to have to pay up a lot of billions of euros. Actually, the Germans had a much better thing going before the euro. That was an informal Deutschmark zone, whereby the Scandinavians, the Swiss, the Austrians, the Dutch, the Belgians had tied their currency to the currencies to the Deutschmark, and that zone was run by the Bundesbank, the German Fed. Now it looks like Germany is strong enough to dominate Cyprus and Greece and maybe Portugal, but it's not strong enough to make France and Italy do the kind of microeconomic reforms that will make these countries competitive again. So I want to repeat a thought that was just expressed. Germany is not so much Mr. Big as the others are Mr. Small. There's a strange thing happening in Europe, that the other great powers, Britain, France, okay, count in Italy if you wish, they're so weak, and that's what makes Germany look so strong. If you look at the German economy right now, there are all kinds of alarm bells shrieking, ringing about Germany's loss of competitiveness, about its loss of productivity, and as we just heard, facing maybe a second recession. So that giant is partially a giant on feet of new clay, or new feet of old clay.
I want to bring up another giant here, and Adrian, I'll go to you first on this. Mikhail Gorbachev, of course, the last leader of the old Soviet Union, was in Berlin for the celebrations a few days ago around the 25th anniversary of the coming down of the wall. And he said that when Russia, speaking of giants, Russia and Germany are friendly, there is peace in Europe. Do those two countries today, in fact, in your view, have a special relationship?
Well, we all thought they did until this crisis. I mean, now it seems as if the personal relations between the Chancellor of Germany and the Russian president, are really terrible, that there's no trust at all. And it may well be that this is the end of a stronger bilateral political relationship. Economically, the two countries are still closely dependent on one another in terms of energy supplies and exports to Russia. But I do think that that link is key, but I wouldn't want to see it in purely bilateral terms, because that doesn't work in our world. It's so interdependent, we need many more forms of multilateral engagement. So I would like to see Poland being a part of this relationship. I'd like to see Britain far more involved, because I think Britain, besides Russia and Germany, has a global outlook. And that's badly needed in Europe at the moment to solve Ukraine, but also to solve the economic crisis and other threats like ISIS.
Janice, when Russia and Germany are friends, there is peace in Europe. Agree or disagree?
I think that's too narrow a lens, actually, because, Russia is currently destabilizing Europe in a very deep way. It's breaking very deeply held ground rules, which the Germans have actually led in enshrining, that we don't change borders by force. So the fact that there is tension between Germany and Russia now is not really a function of Germany. It's a function of Russia's behavior, which is alarming Germany, Britain, France, Poland, and many other countries in Europe. So it's not, I agree, we can't think of these issues in bilateral terms anymore. Even if Angela Merkel was determined to continue to look the other way where Putin was concerned, and she certainly started out that way, Europe would still be destabilized and the European project would still be at risk.
Randall.
I mean, it's absurd. For 40 years, Germany and the Soviet Union had very great tension despite Ostpolitik, and they were at peace. And if one had followed the argument that one makes peace with Russia to make peace in Europe, well, then Berlin would have been handed to the Soviets. Germany would not have been in NATO. Germany would have been demilitarized. I mean, this is ridiculous. And if this relationship is damaged, it's because Putin has unilaterally destroyed it. That's right. This has nothing to do with the Germans.
Joseph, I think when I read the quote out, I think it was your voice I heard in the background yell, wrong.
Yeah. I think we should beware of Germany and Russia becoming too chummy, at least by historical analogy. Whenever they became very friendly with each other, it was anti-Western. The first time round in the early 20s, historians recall this as Rapallo, when the two of them ganged up against the Western powers. And of course, the big one was 1939, when Hitler and Stalin concluded their infamous pact, which allowed Germany to attack both east to Poland, and then in 1940 west into Belgium and Holland and France. So I'm not too enamored of the idea of good German-Russian relations being the underpinning of peace in Europe.
This next question is admittedly, Joseph, in the realm of speculation, but given what you know about Vladimir Putin's priorities, do you think he harbors ambitions to loosen Germany away from NATO and more towards his country?
That used to be the old worry, and a good one. Right now, I think his purpose is more closer to home, so to speak. He's just simply trying to reconstitute the old Soviet empire, both in the south, the former Soviet republics, where it's less dramatic, and of course to his west, our east, where he's literally invading for the second time a neighboring country. First it was Crimea, and now it is Soviet tanks and Soviet special troops, Spetsnaz, without markings, of course, in actually conducting warfare in southeast Ukraine. So I think Germany is not the target right now. And by the way, Angela Merkel, for all this kind of built-in détente imperative that has dominated German policy for the last 30 years, she's actually one of the stronger opponents of Putin, and she's actually done something which I wouldn't have expected. She is joining and maintaining painful sanctions on Russia. So to repeat the basic point, Germany is not the issue for Putin right now. It's the reconstitution of the old empire.
How about the other, Adrian, let me ask about the other Cold War power, the United States. Are there any fears of a rise of anti-Americanism in Germany today?
Mm-hmm.
I think there is a tradition of anti-Western Westernism in Germany, going back already to the 19th century. Think of Nietzsche's fascination with the East, a kind of Asiatic discipline that certain thinkers thought Germany should embody and then impose on others. So I think there is that, but I don't think that's really to do with Russia. I think that's much more to do with the sense in which German and European culture really are quite different from Anglo-Saxon and in particular US culture. And I still think that there is a lot that binds Europeans together, despite horrible world wars, despite continuing tensions. There's a lot Europeans share in common. And I suppose what I would say also in relation to what's been said about Russia, of course, we're seeing destabilization, infiltration, military activity in south and eastern Ukraine on the part of Russia. But I think we shouldn't forget that any country of Russia's size with nuclear weapons is not going to just stand by when a hostile regime is on its borders. Now, of course, it's up to the Ukrainians ultimately, and Russia shouldn't interfere in a unilateral way. But I do think Russia has legitimate interests in Ukraine in the sense of security, in the sense of good neighborly relations. Of course, Russia has to act much more in a much more trustworthy way towards its own neighbors, the Baltic states, Poland, and so on. But I don't think we can just say that it's all Russia's fault And what happened in Kiev is something that Russia was just going to stand by and accept.
I'm not going to let this turn into another show about Russia and Ukraine. I want to get us back on topic here about very mischievous, Adrian. Okay, hang on. Let's. Yeah, I do want to get us back because I mean we all remember 30 years ago Ronald Reagan wanted to put nuclear weapons into Germany, and there were millions of people in the streets protesting against that. Very unhappy with the United States at the time. Do we see any seeds of that anymore?
Let me say history matters.
Yeah.
History really makes a difference, and we can trace those threads of history in two quite different directions. German public opinion was horrified by the thought of an accidental nuclear war, which would place Germany at the center of the nuclear exchange. And you had massive mobilization at the public level to oppose the stationing of weapons. What is this really? This is an echo back to not long ago in history, where Germany, through its own leadership, but nevertheless was devastated by war, and that remains an enduring memory. What's the second way history matters? Germans remember inflation out of control. And when we
they remember that now we're talking 80 years ago.
Well, their parents remember it, their grandparents talk about it. Like we have people in North America who will still talk about the Great Depression and what their grandparents experienced. Okay. Very similar kind of memory, which is actually alive. And when you look at what Angela Merkel has done on the economic front, it's very difficult to understand this embedded reaction that she and the president of the Bundesbank have had without understanding how German history matters to Germans who, regardless of, we could debate responsibility from here till eternity, but they lived through a period of economic and military trauma.
Mm-hmm. Randall.
Yeah, I agree with that. I wanted to say something about anti-Americanism, though. Generally, Germany is, in fact, extremely pro-Atlanticist, pro-American country, and there is a large strain of anti-Americanism, which is actually the same, and comes from the same place that anti-Semitism does in Germany, which is to say, the left. There is a large element, to a degree, but I would actually say more the left than the right. There's a pro-American establishment, of which Joseph is a part, which is very strong in Germany, but which has been tested, not by Russia, but by Snowden and the spying scandal. And that has damaged relations with America much more than anything going on with Russia. I mean, something incomparable.
Joseph, I should give you an opportunity to come back at that if you want.
Well, what the compliment he paid me about being establishment, I like that. I like the interesting thing about Europe and Germany in particular is that there are probably no other country that is more Americanized than Germany, in the sense that we eat, we drink, we dress, we dance, we listen, we watch American, and our store signs abound with American English names of puns, of store sign puns. That sense of Americanization does not go hand in hand with pro-Americanism in the political sense. I think there's a built-in resentment against the power that is so strong, that keeps intruding, that is the steamroller of modernity, which changes ancient dispensations. And from the line I'm just giving you, I bet you it rings a bell in Canada too, where this very, very big neighbor, though Canadians also imitate that neighbor, it is imitation without affection.
You know what, Joseph? We're over that finally, I think, in Canada.
Are we?
Yes.
Over what? Over resentment?
Over resentment and fear, of America.
Well, Janice is over it anyway. I'm not sure everybody is, but okay, fair enough.
But a few people are afraid of you.
Yeah. All right, Adrian, let me get you on this aspect of it. We've hinted at it a bit here. Germany has an awful history that they are still, mind you, taking great strides to come to terms with. Do we want Germany playing a more muscular role on the world stage, or do we fear that? What's your view?
Well, there will be many who will still fear it. In France, in Britain, I think, in other parts as well, in Poland for sure, and countries like the Netherlands and so on. But I think on the whole, if big countries, economically speaking, at the very least, do not take a leadership role, then I think you see the risk of a vacuum, and a vacuum is usually filled by more extreme forces. So I think more engagement, more involvement alongside partners and allies in cooperation with the neighbors and others, I think would be very welcome. So again, on Russia, I think Germany could take an even greater leadership position, being very tough on the one hand, but also trying to put pressure on others in order to really come to a diplomatic solution. I think, for instance, on Libya, an abstention in the Security Council really did German foreign policy a lot of damage, because Germany was sitting on the fence. It wouldn't be in favor, it wouldn't be against. So I think that's not a good position. I think more leadership in Europe, more leadership in Europe's neighborhood, and indeed beyond, would be welcome if it's political leadership and if it's in close consultation with its neighbors.
Janice.
So I think there is an enduring fear of Germany flexing its muscles, but that fear, interestingly enough, largely confined to Europe. So I actually don't agree. I think on Ukraine, although we need Germany as part of the sanctions regime, given how close and interdependent the two economies still are, this is, a high German profile over Ukraine is not helpful, really, even as far as the Ukrainians are concerned. But there is a big, wide world out there, and the United States is engaged on many fronts simultaneously, stressed not in its capacity, but stressed actually in its capacity to manage, in the strength of the team that this particular president has, and in the sophistication of the team. Germans would be invaluable allies on many of the issues globally that its most important ally is engaged on. And we do there really need to see a much higher level of German engagement.
Allies, yes, Joseph, but how about a more muscular leadership role for Germany?
I'm not quite sure in principle I agree. As that famous movie Spider-Man 1, the famous line was, with great power comes great responsibility. I'm not quite sure how that would play out in the case of Germany. Germany, if there is an imperialism, it's an imperialism of fiscal virtue, right?
Yeah.
Trying to make everybody behave as prudently and parsimoniously as the Germans are. They cannot do that. They cannot do it with the large countries as we have seen. If you move to the next step, which is Germany as a strategic actor, that to me is even more inconceivable. Think about this nation that 70 years ago went to the gates of Cairo and Moscow. Today it is seriously overstretched with about 7,000 soldiers abroad. If you look at its defense budget, it's down to about 1.2% of GDP. If you look at its equipment, all these shiny fifth generation fighters, maybe a third of them is fully capable of fully operational, and so are the helicopters and so on. It does not have projection forces. For all of that, it would need to rely on the United States for projection, ammunition, and so on and so on. The upshot of what I'm saying is that do not expect Germany to become a strategic actor. Why? The payoff is so low. If you think about the United States and its power projection over the last 20 years, Afghanistan and Iraq, or NATO in Libya, the payoff was not very impressive. So that is what animates the Germans in addition to their kind of new pacifism that comes out of World War II. There isn't much glory to be gained in being a strategic actor. And that reinforces the natural hesitancy of post-war Germany, which has tried twice to conquer Europe, so to speak, failed ever more miserably, and has figured out that it's much more fun and much more profitable to be a great trading nation.
That's a very
sometimes cultures change. Think about Sweden. Sweden was the most rapacious nation in the 17th century, having conquered half the continent. And look at Sweden today. Sometimes cultural change is profound.
Joe, that's a very instrumental view of history. You only engage if there's a good payoff, and you're not investing.
Well, should I go for a loser?
No, but there is an argument to be made that, you know, investing in building an order from which everybody benefits, including Germany, is a payoff in your terms.
Go ahead, Randall.
No, I was going to say it supports. It relates to a point Janice made, that there's a great fear in Europe of German leadership. I think that greatest fear, though, is not among the French or the British or the Poles, but among the Germans themselves. They are in this their own worst enemy. I take some of Joseph's points about the strategic limitations, though I think economically it could do more and could have much earlier put the screws to Putin than it did. Merkel was typically very belated this. And rhetorically, Germany can play, which is very cheap, as I know, I'm a professor, words are cheap. Rhetorically, Germany could play a leadership role that it does not. And this comes to an issue that Adrian brought up at the beginning, this sort of crushing weight of austerity. The EU worked when it gave people hope of prosperity, hope of democracy, hope of escape from communism. Now there is no hope in the EU. There's no positive vision. And the Germans alone, the Germans uniquely could articulate that.
This is a great segue, since we've got about less than 5 minutes to go, for our last question, which is the West, when that wall was up 25 years ago, represented a real beacon, I think it's fair to say, to so many millions of people in Eastern Europe behind the Iron Curtain. And presumably, that spirit contributed to the end of communism, which, of course, Germany has been celebrating this week, 25 years since the wall went down. Adrian, to you first. Do you think that Western liberal democratic societies are still the beacon to people around the world, as they clearly were a quarter century ago?
Well, a quarter century ago, we heard about the end of history. And forgive the pun, but I think the end of history never began, because that was always going to be a bit of a myth, that the whole world would converge around liberal Western democracy. I think what's unique about Western institutions is not so much the model of Western liberal democracy as we now have it, but rather rule of law, constitutionalism, the dignity of the person. And I think if we want to instill hope in our own people or across the West, and indeed beyond, then we actually need to think much more about the sort of institutions and practices we need to uphold those ideals. I think just formal procedural democracy, as we know, doesn't deliver a strong, robust politics, doesn't deliver a flourishing economy. So we need to come back to really what the West is about. And it's not just the sort of Fukuyama thing about everyone is going to become a liberal Democrat.
Joseph Joffe, how about you? Are we still the beacon we once were?
Right now, authoritarianism is celebrating a kind of comeback. Russian authoritarianism seems to be very successful geostrategically. And indeed, Putin is probably the smartest tactician in the world right now. And there is, on the other hand, China, which is authoritarian capitalism. I think if you look more closely, you see that Russia is a basket case, an economic basket case, a third world economy with nuclear weapons tied to the price of oil. There is no capitalism there, and no decent economic development. And if you look more closely at China, as impressive as it is, you see that it's reaching the limits of authoritarian modernization, as, for instance, exemplified by a 15% growth rate in the 90s, coming down to 7.5. And you could look at the details and see why this is happening, and why this is more than just a kink in the business cycle. And you can also see that China is moving toward that breaking point, where either you go democratic or you become repressive. And if you become repressive, that means the end of spectacular growth as after Tiananmen and the Cultural Revolution. But to come back to the original point, it's very hard for me to see what the countermodel would be with all our failures, with our recessions, with our stalemated politics, not only in the United States. It's not a pretty picture, but it's very hard for me to see a model that would work better than what we have, which is we have all the good things in theory: rule of law, democracy, democratic capitalism. So you want me to bet on the long term? I'll bet on the West.
Okay. Janice?
You know, I think that this authoritarian resurgence is very overblown. There are very few countries that tell, you know, even among, whether you listen to public opinion or you talk to leaders that tell you they want to be like Russia. You don't hear that.
You don't hear that.
No. Just go spend some time in Asia. The rest of Asia is, the forefront of history is not to become like China, it's actually to contain China. They are worried about China, but they don't admire China. So I agree with Joe. It's not that we're so good, it's that the others are so awful.
You're Churchill on this one, eh? We've got
right.
the worst system in the world except for all of the other ones.
Any other alternative is worse.
Got it.
Yeah.
Randall.
Look how people vote with their feet. Look at the immigration figures. Where does everyone want to immigrate to? North America and Europe. The problem is that we've lost confidence in ourselves in the West, and above all, the Europeans have lost confidence in themselves. It's a bit like America in the 1970s, and to agree that loss of confidence is a constructed problem, for all the reasons that Joseph outlined.
But it requires leadership, Randall, and that's where we come back to Angela Merkel, who is in some ways, and I know Joe may think this is unfair, but in some ways uniquely positioned to do that if she can put German history in perspective.
How well has she done that in your view, Joseph Joffe?
Putting German history in perspective?
And therefore been able to take a leadership role in the world, yes.
I think she represents the type of a modern politician or postmodern politician in this more or less in the same camp with Obama and with Cameron and perhaps Hollande. They go with the flow. Leadership is not their sterling, most impressive feature. The kind of postmodern democracy makes leaders put their finger in the wind, plumb the depth, go slowly, change only by a couple of degrees left or right. And Angela Merkel may be the most perfect exemplar of what I'm talking about, but I see similar phenomena in the countries, including the United States and Britain, which I just mentioned. I don't think real kind of postmodern democracy is good for leadership because everybody wants to have a voice, everybody wants to have a veto, and it's like what we do in the press. I mean, suddenly we have millions of people writing blogs and complaining and giving us shitstorms, and so suddenly even the media, the print media, have become a lot more cautious in exposing their flanks.
That was a technical term, incidentally, everybody, in case you hadn't heard that word before.
Yeah, it's a German word.
It is a German word, I see. Okay. It's awfully good of all of you to join us, and may we say happy anniversary to those of you on one time, the other side of the Iron Curtain and the Berlin Wall. Joseph Joffe, the editor of Die Zeit in Hamburg, Adrian Pabst, the political scientist in London, UK, Janice Stein from the Monk School at U of T, Randall Hansen, Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies, U of T. Thanks, everybody.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.